Minho Kong was a man carved from winter. For a decade, the leader of Seoul's most powerful syndicate had existed in a sensory wasteland. His heart beat only to keep him alive, not to feel. His skin was a cold barrier that found no pleasure in the touch of silk or the warmth of the sun. He was a king who ruled from a throne of ice, untouchable and utterly numb. That was until the night he felt the searing heat of Jane's hands. Found bleeding and broken in a rain-drenched alley, Minho expected the darkness to finally take him. Instead, he felt a jolt of pure, terrifying electricity. When Jane, a stunning black woman with eyes like molten amber, pressed her palms against his chest to stem the wound, his world exploded into color. It wasn't just healing, it was an awakening. The dormant hormones he thought he had lost forever ignited like a wildfire, turning his veins into rivers of liquid gold. Now, he is a man possessed. He doesn't just want Jane, he craves the chemical rush her touch provides. He should have let her go back to her quiet life, but a ghost who has finally tasted life will do anything to keep the flame burning. He has brought a beautiful stranger into his den of secrets, unaware that Jane is the most dangerous mystery of all, and the only one he is willing to go to war for just to feel her skin against his once more. Minho Kong was not a man, he was a monument to frozen ambition. At 34, he stood at the apex of the Kong Syndicate, a global empire that moved through the shadows of Seoul like a silent, predatory shark. He was physically perfect, sharp, angular features, eyes the color of obsidian, and a frame that moved with the lethal grace of a trained soldier. But inside, Minho was a hollowed-out shell. For 10 years, he had lived with a condition his doctors couldn't name, a profound sensory numbness. To Minho, the world was a black-and-white movie with the sound turned off. He could drink the finest scotch and taste only water, he could sit in a sauna and feel no heat. Most devastatingly, the touch of a woman felt like nothing more than cold marble. His biological drives had simply withered away, leaving him a powerful, wealthy, and utterly lonely ghost. He had accepted this as the price of his throne. He lived in a penthouse of glass and steel, surrounded by beauty he couldn't enjoy, until the night the silence was shattered. An ambush by a splinter cell of his own men left him stranded, bleeding out from a jagged wound in his side, in a part of the city where his name carried no weight. He collapsed into a pile of trash and wet cardboard, the freezing rain mixing with the warmth of his blood. He closed his eyes, almost relieved that the numbness was finally becoming permanent. Then, he felt it. A pair of hands, firm and impossibly warm, pressed against his shredded suit jacket. The contact wasn't cold. It wasn't marble. It was a bolt of lightning that traveled from his hip straight to the center of his brain. Jane was a woman of vibrant, earthy contrasts. A black woman living in a city that often made her feel invisible, she moved with a quiet, observant strength. She was a healer by nature, a woman who had come to Korea to find her missing sister and worked as a private therapist to fund her search. When she saw the dying man in the alley, she didn't see a mafia boss, she saw a soul slipping away. As she knelt in the mud, her dark skin glowing under the flickering street lamps, she pressed her palms to his wound. In that instant, Minho's heart didn't just beat, it roared. The hormones that had been dormant for a decade surged back to life with the violence of a breaking dam. He looked up, gasping, his eyes locking onto Jane's. She was beautiful, radiant and real in a way his world never was. Her touch was a drug, a resurrection, an addiction that took hold before he could even draw his next breath. He grabbed her wrist, his grip shaking, not to hurt her, but to ensure she didn't stop. He had been a ghost for so long, and this stranger, with her healing hands and mysterious eyes, had just brought him back from the dead. The sky over Seoul was a bruised purple, weeping a cold, relentless rain that washed the neon glow of the city into the gutters. Minho slumped against a damp brick wall in a narrow alleyway, his breath coming in ragged, shallow wheezes. His hand moved to his side, feeling the hot, sticky wetness of blood soaking through his silk shirt. For years, he had been a man of stone, a ghost who walked through life without feeling a single spark of joy or pain. Now, as the darkness began to pull at the edges of his vision, he felt only a familiar, hollow coldness. He was the Ghost King, and it seemed he was finally going to become a real one. His head fell back against the bricks with a dull thud. He closed his eyes, waiting for the numbness to swallow him whole. The sounds of the city, the distant hum of traffic and the splashing of rain, began to fade into a distant murmur. He was ready for the silence. Then, the silence broke. He heard the soft splash of boots in a puddle and the hurried rustle of a raincoat. A shadow fell over him, blocking out the dim light of a flickering street lamp. Minho tried to lift his hand, to reach for the weapon he no longer had the strength to hold, but his arm felt like lead. "Hey! Can you hear me? Stay with me." The voice was like warm honey, rich and deep. Minho opened his eyes a sliver. Through the curtain of rain, he saw a woman kneeling in the grime beside him. Her skin was a beautiful, deep bronze that seemed to glow against the darkness of the alley. Her eyes were wide with concern, searching his face. Before he could pull away, she reached out. She peeled back his blood-slicked jacket and pressed her bare hands firmly against the wound in his side. The moment her palms touched his skin, Minho's entire world didn't just change, it exploded. It wasn't a sharp pain or a cold sting. It was a surge of pure, blinding electricity that raced from the point of contact directly to his heart. It was like a dormant volcano suddenly waking up, sending waves of liquid fire through his veins. For 10 years, his body had been a frozen wasteland, but her touch was a torch. His lungs expanded, pulling in a sharp, desperate lungful of air as his heart hammered against his ribs like a trapped bird. He gasped, his fingers instinctively curling around her forearms. He wasn't trying to push her away, he was anchoring himself to the only thing that made him feel alive. The hormones he thought were gone forever flooded his system, making his skin tingle and his head spin. "You're warm," he wheezed, his obsidian eyes locking onto hers with a terrifying intensity. Jane didn't flinch. She kept her hands pressed to his side, her warmth seeping into his chilled bones. "I've got you," she whispered, her voice steady despite the chaos. "Just breathe. I'm not letting go." Minho watched her, mesmerized. He should have been suspicious. He should have been afraid. But as the rain poured down around them, he realized he didn't care who she was. He only knew that for the first time in a decade, he could feel again, and he was already becoming addicted to the heat. Minho woke up in a room that was too quiet and too cold. The silk sheets of his massive bed felt like thin ice against his skin, a sharp reminder of the numbness he had lived with for so long. He sat up abruptly, his hand flying to his side. The wound was expertly bandaged, the throbbing pain a dull hum compared to the memory of the fire that had raced through his veins in that alleyway. He closed his eyes, trying to summon the feeling again. He could still see the curve of her face and the golden flecks in her dark eyes. Most of all, he could still feel where her palms had pressed against him. It was a phantom heat that made his heart beat faster than it had in a decade. He felt like a man who had spent his whole life in a dark cave and had finally seen the sun. Now that the sun was gone, the darkness felt unbearable. "Sir, you shouldn't be moving," his lead security officer, June, said as he entered the room. "The doctors say you lost a lot of blood." Who was she? Minho's voice was a low growl, cracking from disuse. "We don't know, sir. By the time we tracked your signal to the alley, you were alone. Someone had applied a professional pressure dressing. It saved your life." Minho stood up, ignoring the protest from his healing muscles. He paced the floor like a caged predator. "Find her. I don't want excuses. I want a name, an address, and a life story. Use every camera in the district. If a bird chirped near her, I want to know its song." For the next 12 hours, Minho didn't eat or sleep. He watched the graininess of security footage until his eyes burned. Finally, they found her. Jane. She lived in a small, modest apartment above a flower shop. She worked as a physical therapist, a woman who spent her days healing others while living a quiet, solitary life. Minho didn't send a squad of armed men. He didn't want to break her, he wanted to own the air she breathed. He dressed in a black suit that cost more than her entire building and drove to the flower shop alone. When Jane opened her door, she gasped. She looked smaller than she had in the rain, dressed in a simple oversized sweater, but her presence was just as powerful. The moment she saw him, her eyes went wide. You're alive," she whispered. Minho stepped into her space, his height towering over her. The mere proximity made his skin tingle, a rush of hormones hitting his system like a wave. He didn't pull a weapon. Instead, he reached into his pocket and pulled out a contract. "My name is Minho Kong," he said, his voice dropping to a dangerous, velvet tone. "I have a condition that no doctor can cure, but one touch from you changed everything. I'm offering you a position as my private medical consultant. I will pay you 10 times your yearly salary every month. I will find your missing sister. All you have to do is stay by my side." Jane looked at the paper, then back at the man with the hungry, obsidian eyes. She didn't know she was stepping into a golden cage, but Minho knew he would never let her out. The gates of the Kong estate swung open like the jaws of a sleeping giant. As the black sedan rolled up the long, winding driveway, Jane pressed her forehead against the cool glass. The mansion was a fortress of white marble and tinted windows, standing lonely on a hill overlooking the shimmering lights of Seoul. It was beautiful, but it felt cold, as if the house itself were holding its breath. When the car stopped, the door was opened by a man in a sharp suit who wore white silk gloves. He didn't offer his hand to help her out, he simply bowed and gestured for her to follow. As Jane walked through the grand foyer, she noticed a strange pattern. Every servant, every guard, and every assistant kept their hands strictly behind their backs or tucked into gloves. No one touched the walls. No one touched each other. "Mr. Kong is waiting for you in the conservatory," the guide whispered, stopping at a set of towering glass doors. Jane stepped inside. The room was filled with exotic plants and the scent of jasmine, but the air was chilled. Minho stood by a wall of glass, looking out at the city. He had discarded his suit jacket, wearing only a black silk shirt that hugged the broad lines of his shoulders. When he turned, his obsidian eyes locked onto hers with a hunger that made her pulse jump. "You came," he said. His voice was a low vibration that seemed to hum in the quiet room. "I needed the help to find my sister," Jane replied, trying to keep her voice steady. "But I don't understand this place, Mr. Kong. Why is everyone acting like they're afraid to reach out?" Minho walked toward her, his footsteps silent on the stone floor. He stopped just inches away, so close that Jane could feel the radiating heat of his body. "Because in this house, touch is a crime," he murmured. "To my men, I am a god who cannot be defiled. To my enemies, I am a ghost who cannot be caught. No one has laid a finger on me in 10 years." He moved his arm, the silk of his sleeve brushing against her sweater. He winced, but it wasn't a look of pain, it was a look of intense, concentrated longing. "Except you." Jane felt a heavy tension settle in her chest. She realized then that she wasn't just a consultant or a guest. She was a miracle to him, a rare specimen in a sterile museum. He reached out, his bare hand hovering near her cheek. He was trembling, his eyes searching hers for permission. "They call me the untouchable boss," he whispered, his breath ghosting over her lips. "But I am starving, Jane. And you are the only one who can feed me." Jane stayed still, her heart hammering against her ribs. She saw the loneliness behind his power, the desperate need of a man who had been frozen for a decade. As his fingertips finally made contact with her skin, a soft gasp escaped him, and the cold room suddenly felt like it was catching fire. The clock on the library wall struck midnight, its heavy chimes echoing through the silent mansion. Inside, the only light came from a dozen flickering candles that Minho had insisted on lighting, claiming the harsh electric glare gave him a headache. In truth, the golden glow softened the world, making the shadows feel like a velvet blanket wrapped around them. Jane sat on a low stool, her medical kit open beside her. Minho sat in a large leather chair, his shirt unbuttoned to allow her to inspect the healing wound on his side. The air was thick with the scent of beeswax and the faint, masculine spice of his cologne. As Jane worked, she could feel his eyes on her, tracing every movement of her hands with an intensity that made her skin prickle. "The skin is closing well," Jane whispered, her voice sounding loud in the quiet room. "You're healing faster than I expected." She reached out to apply a cooling ointment, her fingers gently sweeping over the muscled ridges of his torso. The moment her skin met his, Minho let out a jagged breath. His hand gripped the armrest of the chair so hard the leather groaned. He wasn't looking at the wound, he was looking at her lips, his obsidian eyes dark with a hunger he could no longer hide behind his boss persona. "Jane," he groaned, his voice vibrating deep in his chest. "Stop." She paused, her heart leaping into her throat. "Did I hurt you?" "No," he said, his gaze dropping to where her hand rested against his heart. "It doesn't hurt. That's the problem. It feels like I'm drowning and you're the only air I've had in 10 years. My mind tells me to be a professional, to keep this distance. But my body is screaming." The professional mask he wore like armor was cracking. The cold, distant mafia king was disappearing, replaced by a man who looked like he was suffering from a fever only she could break. He reached up, his hand trembling as he covered hers, pressing her palm more firmly against his chest. The heat between them was undeniable, a physical pull that felt like gravity. Jane knew she should pull away. She was here for a job, she was here to find her sister. But as Minho leaned closer, the candlelight dancing in the dark depths of his eyes, she found herself leaning in too. The mystery of who he was mattered less than the fire he ignited in her. "You don't have to be a ghost tonight, Minho," she breathed. He closed his eyes, a shiver running through his powerful frame at the sound of his name on her tongue. The silence of the library was no longer cold, it was a spark waiting for a flame. The morning sun filtered through the tall library windows, but for Minho, the light felt suspicious rather than warm. He had spent the early hours watching Jane sleep from the doorway of her guest suite, his heart warring with his head. He was addicted to her touch, yes, but he had survived in the underworld for a decade by trusting no one. While Jane was in the garden, Minho returned to the library. He found her small leather bag resting on a mahogany side table. His fingers, usually so steady, felt heavy as he reached inside. He pulled out a small, silver locket. It was old and scratched, a stark contrast to the luxury of his home. He flicked the latch, expecting to see a photo of her missing sister. Instead, his blood turned to ice. Inside was a tiny, faded picture of a man with a jagged scar across his chin. It was Lee Sang-woo, the leader of the Serpent clan and the man who had ordered the hit that almost killed Minho in the rain. Minho dropped the locket onto the table, the silver clinking sharply against the wood. The warmth he had felt the night before vanished, replaced by a cold, familiar dread. Had the saving in the alleyway been a performance? Had the electric spark he felt been nothing more than a trap set by his greatest enemy to get an assassin into his bed? "I thought you were my miracle," he whispered to the empty room, his jaw tightening. He began to replay every moment they had shared. Her gentle smiles, the way she looked at him with apparent kindness, and that incredible heat when she touched his skin. Was it all a weapon? If Lee Sang-woo knew about Minho's sensory numbness, sending a woman who could wake him up was the ultimate way to destroy him. By making Minho crave her, they had made him weak. The door creaked open, and Jane stepped in, carrying a small bouquet of wildflowers from the garden. She smiled when she saw him, but the smile faltered when she noticed the locket lying open on the table. The color drained from her face, and she froze in the doorway. "Min-ho, I can explain," she started, her voice trembling. He stood up, the professional mask of the Ghost King sliding back into place. He looked at her not as a lover, but as a predator looks at a threat. "Did he send you?" he asked, his voice a low, dangerous hiss. "Did he tell you to touch me until I forgot who I was?" Jane shook her head, her eyes filling with tears. "It's not what you think. That locket, it's the only clue I have." But Min-ho was no longer listening with his heart. He was a man of shadows again, and the woman who had brought him back to life was suddenly the most dangerous mystery in Seoul. The grand crystal ballroom was a sea of shimmering silk and sharp suits, but Min-ho saw only one person. Jane stood beside him, draped in a gown of deep emerald that made her skin look like polished bronze. She was breathtaking. Every eye in the room was drawn to her, but Min-ho's hand remained firmly on the small of her back, a possessive claim that warned everyone to stay away. Despite the cold suspicion still burning in his mind about the locket, his body was losing the war against her proximity. The air in the gala was heavy with the smell of expensive perfume and the soft hum of violins. To the outside world, they looked like the city's most powerful couple. To Min-ho, it was a beautiful torture. Every time Jane shifted her weight or her arm brushed against his, that familiar surge of electric heat raced through him. He had to clench his jaw to keep his face a mask of cold stone. He wanted to drag her away from the prying eyes of the politicians and rivals, to find a dark corner where he could forget about the Serpent clan and the lies. "Smile, Mr. Kong," Jane whispered, her voice barely audible over the music. "People are staring. You look like you want to kill someone." "I feel like I'm starving in a room full of food," he muttered back, his grip on her waist tightening just a fraction. The jealousy was a new, sharp claw in his chest. He saw the way younger businessmen looked at her, the way they leaned in when she spoke. He hated that they could even look at her. His hormones, once silent and dead, were now a roaring fire that demanded he protect what was his. He felt an overwhelming urge to claim her right there, to show the world that this woman was the only thing that made him feel human. As a slow song began to play, Min-ho pulled her onto the dance floor. He didn't care about the whispers or the cameras. He needed to feel her. As they moved together, Jane's hand slid up to rest on his shoulder, her fingers grazing the back of his neck. Min-ho closed his eyes for a brief second, a shiver of pure pleasure running down his spine. The addiction was winning. Even if she was a spy, even if she was his downfall, he couldn't bring himself to push her away. In the glow of the chandeliers, with her heart beating against his, the danger of her past felt miles away, replaced by a desperate, beautiful obsession. The golden memories of the gala vanished the moment Min-ho stared at the black and white grainy image on his security monitor. The screen showed a side entrance of a quiet library in the city. There was Jane, wrapped in a dark coat, looking nervously over her shoulder before meeting a tall man in the shadows. She handed him an envelope, and in return, he whispered something into her ear that made her nod quickly. To anyone else, it looked like a simple meeting. To Min-ho, it felt like a knife in the heart. He didn't wait for her to come home. He sat in the darkness of the grand foyer, his hands clenched into tight fists. When the heavy front doors finally creaked open and Jane stepped inside, she froze. The light from a single lamp caught the sharp lines of Min-ho's face, making him look more like a statue than a man. "Where were you?" he asked. His voice was so low it was almost a growl. Jane jumped, her hand flying to her chest. I was just out for a walk, Min-ho. I needed some air." "Liars don't get air in this house," he snapped, standing up and closing the distance between them in 3 long strides. He loomed over her, his shadow swallowing her whole. I saw you, Jane. I saw the man. I saw the envelope. After everything I've given you, you're still working with the shadows behind my back. It's not what you think. Jane cried, her eyes filling with tears. He has information about my sister. He told me she was seen near the docks. I had to go, Minho. I didn't want to involve you because I know how dangerous your world is. But Minho was past the point of listening to reason. The jealousy he had felt at the gala had turned into something much darker. His addiction to her touch had made him paranoid. If she was meeting other men, if she was keeping secrets, she was slipping through his fingers. He reached out and grabbed her wrists, not enough to hurt her, but enough to show her she couldn't run. You don't go anywhere without my permission, he whispered, his eyes burning with a dark, possessive fire. You saved my life, Jane, and in return, I gave you mine. That means you belong here. With me. He pulled her closer, his forehead resting against hers. The electric heat was still there, but now it felt heavy and suffocating. He didn't want to be her partner, he wanted to be her cage. He didn't care if it was cheating her freedom as long as she stayed where he could feel her. Jane looked up at him, her heart breaking as she realized the man who had been her miracle was turning into her captor. The silence in the room was heavy, broken only by the sound of Jane's ragged breathing. Minho still held her wrists, his grip a testament to his desperation. The air between them crackled with the same electricity that had saved him in the rain, but now it felt like a storm ready to break. He was the most powerful man in the city, yet he looked like he was falling apart. Tell me the truth, Jane, he demanded, his voice trembling with a mix of anger and raw need. Are you here to destroy me? Was the touch just a lie to get close to the king? Jane wrenched her hands free and stepped back, her eyes flashing with a fire that matched his own. You think everything is about you. You think I would spend every night watching you breathe, healing your body, and losing my own heart just for a hit on your life? She reached into her pocket and threw the silver locket onto the floor between them. It skittered across the marble with a lonely ring. That man in the locket? Lee Sang-woo. He didn't send me to kill you, Minho. He took my sister. I'm here because your world is the only one that touches his. I saved you because I couldn't watch another person die at the hands of those monsters. And I stayed. I stayed because when I touch you, I feel like I'm finally found, too. Minho froze. The cold logic he usually lived by told him to be careful, to push her away, and to protect his empire. His pride screamed that he shouldn't be a slave to a feeling. But as he looked at Jane, really looked at her, he saw the same loneliness and the same bone-deep exhaustion he had carried for a decade. He took a step forward, his obsidian eyes softening. He didn't reach for her wrists this time. Instead, he reached for her face, his thumb gently tracing the line of her jaw. The moment his skin met hers, the world outside the mansion ceased to exist. The rivalries, the money, and the throne didn't matter. The only thing that was real was the heat blooming under his fingertips and the way his heart finally felt like it belonged in his chest. I don't care why you came anymore, he whispered, his forehead leaning against hers. I don't care if you're a miracle or a curse. I am a man who was dead for 10 years, Jane. You brought me back, and I can't go back to the cold. Not without you. His pride had been his shield for a lifetime, but in the quiet of the foyer, he let it drop to the floor like the locket. He realized then that his addiction to her wasn't a weakness, it was the only thing making him human. The next morning, Minho stood in the center of his war room, surrounded by maps and glowing computer screens. His advisors stood in a circle, their faces pale with shock. For years, Minho's only goal had been to expand his power and protect his wealth. He was known for being a greedy king who never gave an inch. But today, he was doing the unthinkable. You want to hand over the Port Authority codes to the Serpent Clan? June, his lead strategist, asked in a shaky voice. "Sir, that is half of our revenue. If you give Lee Sang-woo those keys, he will have more power than us. It will ruin everything we've built." Minho didn't even look at the screens. He was looking at Jane, who stood near the door, her hands clasped tightly in front of her. She looked small against the backdrop of his massive empire, but to him, she was the only thing in the room that had any color. "The codes are just numbers on a screen," Minho said, his voice calm and cold. "They have Jane's sister. To Lee Sang-woo, those codes are a fortune. To me, they are the price of a life. Send the files." "Sir, this is professional suicide," June argued, stepping forward. "The other bosses will see this as a weakness. They will come for your throne." Minho turned his obsidian eyes toward his man, and for a second, the old, terrifying mafia boss was back. "Let them come. I have spent 10 years being a king of a graveyard. I would rather be a man with nothing who can still feel the warmth of a hand than a ghost sitting on a mountain of gold." With a final, decisive click, the files were sent. Minho watched the progress bar hit 100%, knowing that he had just dismantled the shield that protected his syndicate. He was no longer the untouchable boss, he was a target. But as he walked over to Jane, the fear didn't come. Instead, he felt a rush of adrenaline and a strange, new sense of freedom. He reached out and took her hand. The moment their skin met, that electric spark surged through him, stronger than ever. It was a reminder of why he was doing this. Jane looked at him with tears in her eyes, her gaze filled with a mix of awe and heartbreak. "You gave up everything," she whispered, her fingers interlacing with his. "I gave up a cage," he replied, pulling her closer. He didn't care about the money or the power anymore. His greed had been replaced by a hunger that only she could satisfy. By sacrificing his empire, he had finally proven that his heart was no longer made of stone. The moon hung low over Seoul, casting a silvery glow across Minho's bedroom. Outside the walls of his estate, the world was falling apart. His empire was crumbling, and his enemies were surely gathering in the shadows, but inside the room, time seemed to stand still. There were no phones, no guards, and no business codes. There was only the sound of two hearts beating in the quiet. Minho stood by the window, his silhouette dark against the city lights. When he heard the soft rustle of Jane's dress as she moved toward him, his breath hitched. He didn't turn around until he felt her hand come to rest between his shoulder blades. The heat of her touch pierced through his silk shirt, sending a wave of comfort so deep it made his eyes sting. "Tomorrow, everything changes," Jane whispered, her forehead leaning against his back. "Are you afraid?" Minho turned around, taking her face in his hands. His obsidian eyes, usually so hard and distant, were soft with a vulnerability he had never shown another soul. "I was afraid for 10 years, Jane. I was afraid of the cold. I was afraid of never feeling a single thing again. But tonight? Tonight, I am finally alive." He leaned down, his lips brushing against hers in a slow, desperate surrender. It wasn't the kiss of a boss or a conqueror, it was the kiss of a man who had been starving for a lifetime. Jane responded with a fervor that matched his own, her fingers tangling in his hair as she pulled him closer. The electric spark they had felt in the rain was now a roaring bonfire, consuming every doubt and every fear they had left. In the soft glow of the moonlight, they let go of the world. Minho traced every curve of her body with his fingertips, marveling at the way her skin felt like warm velvet under his touch. Every brush of her hand against his chest ignited his senses, making him gasp with a pleasure that was almost painful. It was a night of pure, deep connection, an erotic dance of two souls who had found each other in the dark. They moved together with a gentle intensity, a silent promise that no matter what happened when the sun rose, this moment belonged to them. Minho felt his heart swell, his old life as a lonely ghost finally fading into the shadows. For the first time, he wasn't thinking about power or revenge. He was simply a man in love, addicted to the woman who had given him back his soul. As they lay together in the quiet afterglow, Jane's head on his chest, Minho knew that no matter the cost of tomorrow, this single night of surrender was worth more than his entire kingdom. The air at the abandoned shipping docks tasted of salt and old iron. Minho stood at the edge of a rusting pier, his hand tightly clutching Jane's. Ahead of them, the headlights of 3 black cars cut through the thick fog, revealing the silhouette of Lee Sang-woo. The rival boss stepped forward, a cruel smile twisting the scar on his chin. Beside him stood a young woman who looked remarkably like Jane, but she wasn't tied up or crying. She was standing freely, her hand resting familiarly on Sang-woo's arm. Sarah. Jane's voice was a fragile thread of hope. She tried to rush forward, but Minho's grip tightened, his instincts screaming that something was wrong. Careful, Jane, Sang-woo called out, his voice echoing over the lapping water. Your sister isn't the victim you think she is. She's the one who gave me the codes to your heart. The world seemed to tilt on its axis. Sarah didn't look at Jane with love, she looked at her with a cold, sharp envy. I didn't need saving, Jane, Sarah said, her voice sounding hollow in the mist. I chose this. I'm the one who told Sang-woo where the Ghost King would be that night in the rain. I knew you'd find him. I knew you'd heal him. You always were the good one, the one with the magic touch. Jane stumbled back, the blood draining from her face. The sister she had spent months searching for, the sister Minho had sacrificed his entire empire to save, was the architect of their misery. Sarah had used Jane's own kindness as a weapon to lure Minho into a trap. The plan was simple, Sang-woo laughed, stepping closer. Use the sister to get to the healer, and use the healer to break the king. Now, I have the ports, I have the money, and I have the woman who knows all your secrets. Minho felt a familiar coldness trying to creep back into his bones, but then he looked at Jane. She was trembling, her heart shattering in real time. The secret didn't just hurt, it threatened to destroy the very foundation of why they were together. If her sister was the enemy, was Jane's love just a byproduct of a lie? It was a setup from the start, Minho whispered, his obsidian eyes fixed on the woman who had betrayed them both. He looked at the empire he had lost and the woman he had found. The betrayal was deep, and the danger was real. Sang-woo's men began to close in, their shadows long and menacing on the pier. Minho had no army left, no codes, and no throne. He only had Jane, and for the first time, he realized that the truth didn't matter as much as the woman standing next to him. The chaos of the docks didn't end in blood, but in a silence that broke the Serpent clan forever. Minho had played one last card. He hadn't just sent the codes, he had sent a virus that locked every account the moment Sang-woo tried to access them. As the police sirens wailed in the distance, called in by a secret tip from June, Sang-woo and Sarah were forced to flee into the night, their power gone and their names ruined. They had wanted a kingdom of gold, but they ended up with nothing but the wind. 6 months later, the air in the small coastal villa was sweet with the scent of sea salt and blooming jasmine. There were no marble halls here, and no men in silk gloves guarding the doors. The Ghost King was officially dead to the world, buried under the wreckage of the empire he had happily let burn. In his place was a man who woke up every morning to the sound of waves and the warmth of the sun on his face. Minho stood on the wooden deck, watching the sunrise paint the sky in shades of pink and orange. For the first time in his life, he didn't just see the colors, he felt them. He felt the breeze on his neck and the cool wood beneath his feet. He was no longer a statue. He was a man made of flesh and blood, alive in every sense of the word. He felt a familiar heat before she even touched him. Jane stepped out onto the deck, her dark skin glowing in the early light. She wore a simple white sundress, her eyes bright with a peace she had never known in the city. When she slipped her hand into his, that electric spark, the one that had saved him in the rain, surged through him once more. It wasn't a shock anymore, it was a heartbeat. What are you thinking about? Jane asked, leaning her head against his shoulder. I'm thinking about how much I used to have, Minho murmured, bringing her hand to his lips and kissing her knuckles. And how I was actually a beggar. I had 1,000 men and 1,000,000,001, but I couldn't feel the rain. I couldn't feel the heat. He turned to her, his obsidian eyes clear and filled with a deep, permanent devotion. I gave up a kingdom of stone to find a kingdom of feeling. Jane smiled, and the warmth of it felt better than any crown. They had built a new life together, one where touch wasn't a crime and love wasn't a trap. Minho was no longer the untouchable boss. He was a man who lived for the brush of a hand and the whisper of a name. As the sun rose higher, he pulled his queen into his arms, finally home, finally whole, and forever addicted to the light she brought into his world.